Welcome to the next edition of Grid Forward Chats. I'm Bryce Yonker with Grid Forward. Today we have with us two amazing guests on a deep dive regulatory and policy topic. Rich Sedano is there at Regulatory Assistance Project, and Danielle Sass Byrnett is with NARUC. Thanks for being on with us. Rich, maybe I'll start with you. Can you introduce yourself and give us an overview about who you are?
Well, I'm Richard Sedano, and I'm the Senior Director for Innovation at the Regulatory Assistance Project. And I've been with RAP for 24 years, and before that, for 16 years, I was at the Vermont Department of Public Service, most of those as commissioner. And I enter all of this from a technology perspective. I'm an engineer and work for a utility right out of college in power plants.
Thanks, Rich. We had you on for I think season 1. So welcome back. Thanks for being on the podcast again. Over to you, Danielle.
It's so nice to be here, Bryce, and with you, Rich. I'm Danielle Sass Byrnett. I'm NARUC's Senior Director for the Center for Partnerships and Innovation. NARUC is, of course, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. And I've been here leading the team that provides technical assistance to commissioners and commission staff for almost 7 years. Before that, I spent about 10 years in the federal government at Department of Energy and at EPA, supporting state energy offices and state environmental agencies. And my background is more around science and public policy, and a real focus on helping whatever part of the state needs help on their energy policies and programs. So thanks for inviting me.
RAP and NARUC are truly the leaders in this area. Thanks for being on with us. All right, so before we really dive in, let's lay a little bit of a foundation. I'll have you start, Rich. What are you seeing as some of the main drivers that are unfolding in the energy landscape right now?
Well, main drivers, I wish you could say that all the main drivers are pushing in the same direction, but there's a lot of conflict. On the one hand, we have legacy industries. We have gas that's never been bigger as a part of our economy. But we have climate effects that people are starting to experience. We have sustainability interests from corporations. The private sector is huge, and what we see sustainability influencing all kinds of policies, and not just from the tech industry, although perhaps that's where you think first, but from all over. The customers have more options. And if customers have more options, that means that the sense that the utilities control everything is no longer valid, and it's getting less so every year. An important driver is electrification. We see a lot of buildings going to electric heating and hot water heating. We see a lot of cars on the roads. And I think soon we're going to see a lot of trucks on the roads that are electric. And industries are, going back to the sustainability issue, industries are thinking about what they can electrify. I wish that equity were more of a driver. I think it still is, but I think it could be better. So I'll stop there and let Danielle.
Yeah, what do you want to add or double on for that, Danielle?
Of course, we're living in the same world, so I see most of the same things that Rich does. I will just add that extreme weather events are a really significant force, inspiring a lot of thought and action, I think, across the commission and utility space. I think the changing power technologies and capabilities and controls, a lot of things you think about, Bryce, are hugely influential in what's possible now. And there's both push and pull, in building on what Rich was saying about customer choice. And then, we do have a dozen states that have equity mandates that come through the commissions. And so maybe in 2024, it doesn't feel as significant as it was in 2022, but it's still there. And I think it's still inspiring real work. I do want to also add this, the supply chain challenges are very, very real in the electricity and utility marketplace right now. And so that's, I think, a big challenge space for our members and for our industry as they're dealing with the onshoring, the electrification, the customer choice, et cetera. So those are a few of the background pieces that I think are in this context.
Great. We're going to cover all of that. we could take the whole session on this, so let's be as brief as we can as possible. I'll have you start, Danielle. But generally defined and described, how do we regulate and make decisions about the grid capabilities that are invested here in the U.S.?
I will try to be simple. It is extraordinarily complicated, unfortunately. And as I say to make people many times, this is not the decision-making system that we would have set up if we had a goal-oriented desire in the beginning. But we have federal regulators, of course, regulating interstate commerce with FERC. We have the regional transmission organizations and the RTOs, who are not regulators, but are decision makers, determining what's going to be happening across regions and across utilities. And then, of course, the members that I represent in the state utility commissions. The state utility commissions typically regulate all the IOUs, investor-owned utilities in their state. Some of them regulate some of the rural electric cooperatives, usually not to the same degree. And then there's also local municipalities and co-op boards that regulate the municipal utilities, the cooperative utilities. And then we have some fun outliers like federal power authorities. So that's where the regulation is. The decision-making is usually with the utilities. And they're first and foremost, they're the ones that are making significant decisions about what is going to go on the grid, influenced by other state agencies, influenced by state laws, of course, and energy stakeholders. But I think that's the fundamental as I try to describe it.
Anything you want to add to that, Rich?
Well, it's an incredibly rigorous set of processes that Danielle talks about. And of course, there's literally hundreds of organizations that fit into the scope of what Danielle said. So if somebody from another country says, what's the U.S. policy on technology deployment? Well, the DOEs does a few things, but in terms of decision making, it's incredibly fractionalized. And the one thing I will say, though, is that there is an effort to try to understand what the public interest is in all of these decisions. And I guess what I'll say is that I think some of the advocates for change are good about explaining what it looks like from their perspective, but are not so good at explaining it from the public interest perspective. And so I think we have everybody needs to improve, but it's not just the institutions that need to improve. I think the advocates for change need to improve also in trying to explain the public interest value in what they're offering.
All right. Well, that's as much foundation laying as we're going to offer, and we're diving in deep, straight into performance-based incentives. So aligning incentives is really important as we drive towards the outcomes, as you had mentioned, Danielle, that we're looking for. How can tools like performance-based regulation and the similar aspects, how can those be structured so they point us in the right direction for the outcomes that we're looking to have? I'll let you start, Danielle.
Sure. The aspirations of performance-based regulation make a ton of sense. And it is highly logical to say, if we incentivize the utilities to achieve certain metrics and outcomes, we will pay them more, that will motivate them, and we will get better outcomes. And I said, philosophically, that is extremely sound. In practice, it's been a lot harder. We at NARUC have been working with a collective of state utility commissioners and commission staff for about 5 years. We organized a PBR state working group. In the early days of that, it was very much about exploring the degree to which and if PBR could be valuable. And there was a lot of sensitivity around even the term. We wrote a paper on PBR in the context of demand flexibility, which is available and open to anyone, and lays out the fundamentals of PBR and the logic of it, in addition to some of the particular examples. And our members and advocates often look to a relatively recent database that RMI put together on performance incentive mechanisms. So there are some places to go to get some good information about what PBR is and what it aspirationally can do. Practically, it's been really slow going. So Hawaii is, I would say, the only state that's really implemented PBR in a consequential way. And their state legislature told the commission, thou shalt figure this out and remove cost of service rate making as the model for making the utility whole and figure out PBR. And so they've certainly taken that very, very seriously, and a lot of working groups and a lot of ongoing assessments about how well the different PIMs, performance incentive mechanisms, and other strategies are working. So there's a lot to learn there for sure. In other states, the legislatures have generally told the commission that this is allowable, but not required. And as you can imagine, there might not be a lot of utilities who are very excited to say, I'm going to completely change my business model, and I'm going to propose a PBR framework for how I'm compensated, and therefore open up the uncertainty of what my compensation is going to look like. So there's not been a lot of uptake in most other states. Connecticut right now is working diligently on their PBR framework, and we expect a lot more to come out of that state in the next year or so as to what their goals are, what are the metrics, what are the data they're going to track, what are the metrics, and ultimately what incentives or disincentives there might be. Part of the challenge here is the complexity. And we at NARUC, my predecessor, put together a really cool Excel-based game called the Mega Model game that shows the differences between cost of service regulation and performance-based regulation. And we have 4 metrics in there. We've played it with folks across the country, lots of NARUC members, advocates, federal folks, and others. We have 4 metrics in there. And the typical takeaway is it's really hard to balance all 4 of these metrics in a way that sets you on a positive path as a utility. And that's with 4. So it's really hard. I hope Rich can point to some other bright spots.
Well, I want to say 2 things. One is that states have a real problem with long-term thinking. They deal with issues that are before them, and they resolve them. Administrative law agencies are good at that. But to do performance regulation well, I think PUCs need to have a clearer sense of what the power sector is trying to accomplish under their direction, with somewhat more detail than the statutes tend to offer in terms of guidance, more specificity. And I think PUCs generally don't have a North Star to use for performance regulation that's good enough. Hawaii's been good at that, perhaps out of need. It's perhaps helpful that they have exceedingly high rates that have motivated them to feel that they have to do that. Anyway, that's one point. The other point is picking up on something that Danielle said, but maybe a little different way. We focus our utilities on a return on capital, and we don't focus them on a return on performance. And I think this is an idea that ought to be compelling, that customers, citizens, should expect a return on performance. And at the moment, the only thing they know is if there's a blackout. Pretty much that it's either it's working or it's not working. And we should be able to figure out better ways. RMI's index of performance indicators is good. It is complicated to create performance indicators. But I want to step back and say, we just don't have the concepts, the return on performance, what's the North Star. We have to do those things before we can really expect the details to follow.
Maybe we'll be quick here so we can get into some of the deeper details, because I wanted to ask a similar question, which is around, basically we've regulated the sale of kilowatt hours volumetrically, and we've adjusted it around the edges. But how do we make effective progress towards a different structure that aligns towards a model that works better? And it sounded like maybe you had some follow-on thoughts, Danielle.
Go ahead, Rich. You can respond to that, and I'll circle back.
Innovation doesn't do well in an evidentiary process where you're just asking people questions and people are just justifying what they came in the room with. Innovation requires people to suspend their starting positions and accept that we're trying to solve a common problem that we all have, that we're all sharing in the effort to solve a common problem. And so several PUCs, many PUCs have experience with different kinds of alternative processes, collaboratives, work groups, things that allow for people to engage. I think we need a ton more of that, an exponential amount more than that, of that. And sure, there's going to have to be an evidentiary process to put things into action. But to explore what's possible, to explore what ways that many people's problems can be solved all at once. I think we've talked about how complicated it is to solve everybody's problems all at once. Well, you don't do it at all in an evidentiary process. You have a chance of doing it in a collaboration. So I think process is a huge part of the answer.
I was going to add a couple of things. One, there has been good experience using performance incentives and performance-focused regulation on things like energy efficiency. And that's been in place for decades, and Rich probably had a hand in a lot of it. There's also increasingly work around performance-focused incentives on reliability and penalties for lack of reliability in different places. So there are some bright spots, and I think there are a lot of people trying to learn from those and figure out how we can do more so that it's not just at the edges, as you were saying, Bryce. I think my members would say they need clear state policy because most commissions don't see themselves as policy makers. They see themselves as policy implementers. And so it took the Hawaii legislature saying, you need to figure out PBR in ways that the Nevada legislature saying you should figure out if PBR is an option, should be an option, is fundamentally different. And so if there is a clear policy direction from policy makers, the commissions will figure this out. And process improvements certainly should be part of it. We are, in fact, seeing a lot more effort to get out into communities among commissions and their colleagues at the energy offices to have broader investigatory proceedings, dockets, things that don't require a lawyer to represent you in order to participate. NARUC did a paper 3 years ago on stakeholder engagement processes, and we looked at a dozen different states that, even by that point, had gone for these broader approaches to engage communities and get input beyond the typical quote unquote interveners. So there's a lot of process improvement happening there. And that will certainly, couldn't agree more, Rich, that will be necessary for something like getting PBR right. You have to figure out your state policy goals. You have to translate those to electricity system objectives. You need to figure out what data you are going to have to collect. You have to identify what metrics you might benchmark. There are a lot of steps and a lot of people need to be involved in those.
And I'm glad you covered the complexity to it. It's just, to be honest, to insert my own opinion, that's my concern as well, right? Is it's a great idea, but the complexity is where I get really concerned. Well, I want to ask two questions that I think are often, and sometimes in reality, kind of like a seesaw. So we're going to start on reliability and resilience, and then I want to follow that up right away with affordability. So we've noticed that figures for reliability and resilience in a lot of places are not necessarily trending in a positive direction. There's a lot of major impacts and outages and storms and all sorts of things that are impacting the service of our systems. And the hardening solutions can be quite costly. So how do we balance, the quality of the service and trying to tackle reliability, and what sort of metrics and areas can we focus on? I'll save the affordability question for the next one right after it.
Well, first of all, let's separate bulk power and distribution. I think a lot of the problems are happening at distribution. And it's perhaps a comfort to start with the fact that the bulk power system's reliability is still pretty good. Now, that's still vulnerable in some cases to a few of the extreme weather and climate-induced effects that we've talked about already. Wildfires in the West, for example. I think resilience is a really great issue for progress. There's a lot of issues that we've been around and around and around on, and then you just have to make decisions. Resilience, I think there's still a lot of understanding that needs to be developed, and I'll just tell you how I understand it. And one of the reasons why I think this is a useful thing to talk about is the number of people who want some sort of quantitative approach to resilience. I don't see a quantitative approach to resilience as useful. I think of resilience as scenarios that are vulnerable, that make a place vulnerable. What are the vulnerabilities? Where do people go if there's a problem? Maybe we can't protect all the people in their homes, but we can protect them in some central place. So that's just a different example of how we protect citizens. All of the climate-induced matters, all of these can be a public safety person who considers disasters all the time can think about the kinds of resilience vulnerabilities that the grid presents to the public interest. And then we can think about cost-effective ways to deal with those. I think it is important to approach it that way, because that gets you then to the how much is it going to cost you to do these things. Well, if you've gone through a thing of, well, we don't want this flood surge to totally destroy our coastal community, or we don't want this fire risk to destroy all of these places where people live and work, or any other kinds of resilience exposure that we have. I think it's important to approach it from a scenario approach and then a solution approach where the power grid is a part of the answer, but there are many other parts of the answer that deal with how we're going to protect people and property. I think that's a place that is tough for PUCs, because they have part of the solution, but they don't control all of the solution. And this is one of those classic government issues where silos can get in the way of what the public interest is in terms of how do we solve the public interest problem. But I do think that we have to figure out, and this now becomes a governor's issue, how we figure out what our vulnerabilities are. I live in Rhode Island. Southern Rhode Island knows what its vulnerability is. It's storm surges. And so there's approaches to deal with those things. I think every community has to start thinking about what their vulnerabilities are, and then engage the PUC or the Energy Office, whichever one is the most appropriate, to figure out where the power sector contribution to that solution should be.
Yeah, and I can pick up from that, Rich, I think pretty nicely with the idea of where the investments can be made and how we're going to find the money for it. We can't ever get to 100% reliability. We can't ever get to 100% resilience. Nobody can afford it. It's not ultimately worth it. But, we can establish our aspirations for what we expect for the time that it will take to get people to safety and ensure that they have access to the critical functions that they need in order to survive and get back to thrive. There's been a lot of work happening funded by the Department of Energy with the national labs, and a lot of it in partnership with states on resilience and resilience investments over the last few years. So last year, NARUC republished a federal funding guidebook on resilience investment opportunities that outlines a couple dozen programs across all of the federal government that can be used to support power sector resilience, which is, as you said, just one component, but that's still a substantial opportunity space. Right now, as I certainly know Bryce knows, there's a lot of federal funding available in the program 401D, which is the state resilience for electricity systems, and GRIP funding. The initial money there has been supporting a lot of resilience planning happening across utility commissions and state energy offices. We've been pulling in utility consumer advocates. Emergency management agencies have been coming in to some degree as well. And there have been cohorts recently, over the last year, working on things like resilience metrics, resilience valuation, regulatory frameworks and processes that can support the analysis of resilience investments and establish those goals and metrics and decide how they're going to prioritize potential investments that would be supported by ratepayers ultimately through utility investments. So we're making strides forward, and I think we're getting to a better place for having those scenario-based state-by-state discussions that ultimately can lead to what I think is most important, which is community resilience. And agree, Rich, that the power sector is one part of that, but it's not the answer, but it is obviously a critical part of that. And our members also regulate water and telecom as well. And so they're interested in more than just the electricity system too. And they have really important roles that support community resilience.
Grace, I just wanted to add a grace note. Public interest, public safety microgrids are a really important and emerging technology-based solution that I hope more places will take a look at. The essence of them is that the key things that need to be protected and supported are identified and have a higher degree of ability to ride through a problem than the general community. It's a great way of thinking about it.
Yep.
I was just going to, there's excitement about the potential for massive rolling batteries with electric school buses. And we've got all sorts of really exciting emerging technology solutions. Yeah. But ultimately, we need to be listening to communities, local communities who are going to be impacted by various events. And what do they actually need in the context of the broader system? And how can we achieve that with the overused term, but braiding of different resources and ways of providing them with support?
I'm going to not tangent because it's super hard for me not to on that topic and bring up the affordability question, because I think that in conjunction is just so critical. You're seeing rate pressure in many locations across the country, across the world, which disproportionately impacts the people that are most vulnerable. How can we modernize our grid but balance the outcome of affordability? And I'll let maybe you start, Rich, and Danielle start, because I think it's so critical having that conversation after you have the resilience one.
Well, it is important to be rigorous about the costs that the monopoly entity that passes its cost through to captive ratepayers. We need to be rigorous about what those costs are. But what those costs have to be need to be paid, because the society will be pay a lot more in all kinds of ways if we don't do that. So the investment has to be made. So then there's a question of who pays. And I think if affordability is an issue in a place, there are tools to basically provide discounts or other relief for income sensitive people who need it. And I think some places do that. I don't think it's too sophisticated. I think there is an emotional or political sense that it needs to be dealt with in order to go from everybody pays the same to we need to help the people who need help. And I think those places need to reckon with that.
I mean, this is the $1 million question. How do we modernize the grid to meet everyone's needs without hurting ratepayers? So taxpayer funding is one approach. Maybe we don't put everything all on ratepayers. One of the benefits of federal funding and state funding writ large is that it tends to be coming from less regressive structures. What Rich is suggesting would be making ratepayers rate structures less regressive, right? Which has a societal benefit to it for sure. I think we also just need a lot more energy efficiency. So let's get the need for electricity to be much lower. Every model about how to decarbonize anywhere says energy efficiency is a huge part of the equation. And certainly as a country, we've made quite a bit of progress, but there's just a lot more to do. There's a lot more opportunity. We don't run out of energy efficiency. So doubling down on what we can get from that capacity, especially right now as we see electrification and load growth coming. I mean, we need more headroom in the system we have right now. And if we use energy efficiency to do that, then we are lowering the costs. We're lowering the bills for those who have implemented those measures. And that's a really high value proposition. I also think there's a tremendous opportunity to better balance the timeframes of the costs and the benefits here. And I've spent a lot of time in EV space recently. And we talk regularly about how having more users on the system, in electric vehicle users, if they're using it at the right times, can put downward pressure on rates because we're spreading the costs of them. And that's fantastic. And I don't think there are a lot of reasons to dispute that assertion. But it requires a lot of building now, and those benefits are going to come farther into the future. And so I would love to learn more about innovations in cost allocation and rate design, and how do we finance these investments in ways that better balance the timeframes of the cost and the benefits.
Maybe I can, while we're on this topic, Rich, send this one over to your direction. Are there some stuffs on advanced rate structures, tariffs, even pricing, where you've seen those advanced structures starting to find success or kind of frame the way that we've historically done it?
Well, absolutely. The flat rates, time insensitive rates send a signal to the customers that there's plenty of power and we can always make more, and it doesn't matter when you use it or anything. And I think more states are opening up to the idea that we can expect people to adapt to some relatively simple but still very compelling and economically sensible rate system that differentiates between one time and another. I was just talking to some people in South Carolina lately about instantaneous demand charges that are starting to flourish among public power entities there, and they seem to be having the effects that they want. I'm always liking to talk about the Oklahoma Gas and Electric opt-in variable peak pricing program that they have, which helps them manage their wind generation in Oklahoma and allows customers the opportunity to save money, which I think since they're opting in and 20% of mass market customers are subscribed, they are saving money. And they stay on it for a long time, and people want to get on it. So I think there are lots of opportunities. We still have the law in New York that forbids this, based on, I think, an incorrect assumption that we need to protect customers against crazy economics. I think that there needs to be an association between climate and public benefits and the idea of giving customers more opportunities to understand what the effects of their consumption are and to use their capacity to adapt as a positive thing. And of course, technology is going to make it even easier for customers to do these things. So why not? I always like to talk about the Elevate Energy used to be Center for Neighborhood Technologies pilot from like 20 years ago in Chicago that demonstrated that low-income customers are happy to save money and are very capable of figuring out simple ways of doing that. There's a lot of safety net programs that they figure out that are more complicated than this. They figure it out, and the rest of us can do it too.
Thanks again to our seasoned sponsor, Virtual Peaker. If you enjoy Grid Forward Chats, please follow us on your favorite podcast platform, give us a like or a review, and tell your colleagues. You can listen to all episodes and learn more about our efforts to advance the grid at gridforward.org.